many of you in the audience, I wear multiple hats, as Johan mentioned. I'm a daughter, a sister, a wife, a chocoholic, microbiologist, global health professional, but most relevant to you all, I'm a passionate advocate for collective action against epidemics. But how did I become that? Well, let me take you back a couple of years. One of my earliest, most painful memories as a child is getting chickenpox. And like some of you who might have gotten chickenpox as a kid, I was confined to my room, all alone. I couldn't play with my friends. I couldn't scratch. I couldn't even hit my brother. I mean, who doesn't want to hit their younger brother, right? Well, so I was clearly really upset. And I asked my mom, why is this happening to me? And she said, honey, you're sick. You have a disease. It's caused by these invisible microcreatures called viruses. Well, that was the beginning of my fascination with viruses. And just how obsessed was I? Well, my friends played with dolls and other fun things. I had giant stuffed microbes. Stuffed Ebola, stuffed HIV. Well, yeah. But growing up in India, this obsession with microbes led me to become a very keen observer of epidemics. And I saw different outbreaks happen, from dengue, chikungunya, the plague in Western India, and very close to India, SARS outbreak. And I remember reading about these airline pilots in India who were afraid to fly from India to the SARS-affected countries because they were afraid. And that's when it really hit me, that diseases have consequences beyond the medical. They have a huge impact on our psyche because they elicit fear. So let's talk about the latest kid on the block when you talk about diseases, Zika virus. I'm sure some of you have just come back from summer vacations, and while planning your visit, you must have given a thought to Zika. Well, according to World Bank, Zika cost the economies of the affected regions in Americas alone $3.5 billion in just 2016. Now, that's expensive. That's really expensive. Well, epidemics are expensive. But why are they so expensive? Yes, they impact mortality, morbidity, productivity, all of that. But a very important factor, and that is fear. So you can guess why. By the way, this is my favorite movie. But more than the movie, I love the tagline, nothing spreads like fear. And that is especially true when you talk about epidemics. So the cost of fear is high. SARS cost the global economy $40 billion in just a matter of 12 weeks. Ebola cost the economies of Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea $2.8 billion. That's super expensive. But 80 to 90% of that cost was due to fear. So let's focus on Ebola for a second, because that's what my research focused on. More than 28,000 people got infected. It reached 10 countries. And one of those countries was Nigeria. And let me take you back to April 2014, where I was sitting in a conference on Ebola, and the mood in the air was that it is literally game over if Ebola reaches Lagos, a city of 21 million people in Nigeria. Well, guess what? Unfortunately for us, Ebola did reach Nigeria. But fortunately for us, Nigeria contained it in 93 days. And it was such a remarkable feat that Hollywood decided to make a movie on it. And guess what it's called? 93 Days. But Ebola cost the economy of Nigeria $186 million, according to estimates. That's less than 0.03% of their GDP. But is that all that was to it? Or were there costs that we missed? So I decided to look at the impact of Ebola on the Nigerian private sector and to look at the role private sector can play in building epidemic resilience. So I did this study in Nigeria with 78 people representing 50 stakeholders across 11 economic sectors. And then I triangulated my research using a small survey. What did I find? I found that the costs were higher than the estimated $186 million because there were hidden, intangible, indirect costs attributed to fear, attributed to misinformation. I found that even sectors that you thought would do well in an epidemic, like the pharma sector, They actually suffered losses because of changes in consumption behavior as well as demand shocks. I found strong evidence of what I call the pheronomic effects. What is pheronomic effects? I bet you're asking. Well, let me tell you. Pheronomic effects, as I define it, refers to the impact on the economy because of misinformation and fear-based aversion behavior that is exhibited not only by individuals, but organizations and countries during an epidemic. How does that work? Well, when a new disease reaches a geographical region, or it's a novel disease, there is an information vacuum that leads to misinformation and also distorted perception of disease by media. Of course, how lethal is that disease? What is the case fatality rate? Further exacerbates the pheronomic effects. But how does that impact the economy? Well, first of all, it affects your behavior. It can lead to stigmatization. It can lead for people to change the way they buy things. For example, in Nigeria, there was a 400% spike in buying sanitizers. Now, one would think, clearly, that's going to lead to profits. But no. A lot of companies that make sanitizer did not expect that. So because of the demand shock, they actually suffered losses. People started buying more antibiotics, and that can lead to implications for antimicrobial resistance because of self-medication. That can impact the economy. Bakery sales went down. Meat sales went down. It resulted in life disruptions. Schools were shut down. That affects the economy as well. It can lead to financial impact as well. For example, especially when you talk about behavior, 75% of people that I surveyed said they were wary of going to crowded areas. And that has implications for retail sector in terms of finances. Aviation sector is another example. They saw a reduction of their revenue by 40% because of 70% reduction approximately in flight occupancy. When I spoke to pharmaceutical sector, across board, I found 10 to 15% reduction in sales because people were afraid to go to doctors. Banking sector, they stopped lending to individuals and hospitals during that time, to schools. That affects the financial sector as well. What else? Well, according to the people I surveyed, 16% of people reported job loss due to Ebola. People said that food prices went up, they bought food in bulk, and as a result, 28% of people said they had loss of income attributed to Ebola outbreak. But most interestingly, 79% of people said they stopped hugging. How does that affect the economy, huh? Well, Nigeria is a really warm country. People are very warm. They love to hug. Well, if you're not hugging people, it can actually lead to trust issues. It can affect your client relationships. It can affect negotiations in business, and that can affect the economy. It affected health. It changed the way people sought healthcare. Across board, when I spoke to hospitals that did not even have an Ebola patient, they said their patient volume went down by 30 to 50%, and that affected finances of those hospitals. It affected health services. There was health service interruption because hospitals started turning away patients with fever. That affects the economy as well because it can impact other health outcomes which can impact the economy by productivity and so on. And of course, when I talk about health, how can I not talk about the Index Hospital that played a very important role in diagnosis of Ebola in Nigeria, one of the finest hospitals in Lagos. And by the way, this is the room where the Index patient stayed. Of course, it's been decontaminated since then. In the words of the medical director of the hospital, it was as if they jumped on a grenade. And why did he say that? One of the finest hospitals, even after they were decontaminated, more than 90% of patients refused to come back. Even a year later, when I spoke to him, only 20% of patients had come back. And other hospitals saw what happened. And as a result, they started turning away any patient with fever, a very non-specific symptom. There was a lot of stigmatization of healthcare workers as well. People were afraid. If you're a doctor, you're a nurse, people didn't want to hang out with you. It affected business continuity. Projects were delayed, training venues were moved. I spoke to one shipping supply company that reported $6.3 million loss because of delayed projects. That is how it impacts the economy. So huge impact due to pheronomic effects. But we're here at a big data conference, so I obviously have to talk about data, right? Well, Ebola was unique in the fact that initially there was no data. There was an information vacuum. And then, as a result, there was misinformation or bad data. And why is that important? Well, that's what drives the fearonomic effects. So I actually surveyed people, and I said, how do you think Ebola spreads? 68% of people said they think it spreads through touch. 28% said pork. Remember, meat sales went down? 23% said it spreads through air. And then I asked them, how did you get this information? 71% of people said social media. Now, I love social media, and I'm sure so do you guys. But social media can not only disseminate good information quickly, it can also disseminate bad information quickly. And that can lead to problems. How? Well, the index patient that came to Nigeria with Ebola was a Liberian diplomat whose sister had died of Ebola. And he was in quarantine, but he still flew to Nigeria, breaking his quarantine, in search for holy water that was marketed by one of the Nigerian pastors to cure AIDS, to cure Ebola. That single case of transmission led to 20 infections and 8 deaths. And that is the impact of bad data. There were rumors rife during the outbreak that if you consume a lot of salty water or bathe in it, you can protect yourself from Ebola. Well, that leads to high-risk behavior. In fact, there were 20 people who were hospitalized because they consumed excess of salty water, and 2 died. And that is the impact of bad data as well. So the virus isn't the only enemy. So is fear, so is lack of information and bad data. So how do countries limit these fearonomic effects? Well, let me tell you. First of all, swift response from governments help. In Nigeria, government was really proactive. So a lot of airlines that stopped flying to Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea continued to fly to Nigeria, not only because it was a really big market, but they felt confident in the measures that government was taking. Employing visible measures help. The people I surveyed, 93% said that if the person in front of them was using sanitizers or changing gloves, they actually felt confident in doing business with them. And that was even true for hospitals. Using past experience in data collection helps. And Nigeria was really lucky that they had polio emergency operations centers in place. They had people who could collect data, they had people who could do contact tracing. And that was really useful in time of the Ebola outbreak in Nigeria. Partnering with community leaders, traditional rulers, and influencers really helps because they can help you dispel bad data, dispel myths. Of course, dissemination of good data is equally important. And to give you an example, there was a Twitter-based platform called Ebola Alert, which was doing a fantastic job in not only disseminating accurate information on Ebola, but it played a key role in ruling out false information when there was a false alarm of an epidemic of Ebola in Nigeria that was ruled out. So they played a major role in coordinating, a very big role that social media tools can play. Of course, partnering with private sector helps. So private sector can help in preparedness, in response, in recovery, all 3 stages. And how? Well, by protecting their core business operations, first of all, by having contingency plans in place, by ensuring that the accurate information is reaching out to their human resources. Private sector has expertise and skills. For example, they can help with logistics during an epidemic. They can help with forecasting. If they get access to data from governments, they can actually forecast potential epidemics. That's a really big deal. That's a big area where private sector can play a role. Donating cash or helping out in kind is another area. Private sector has skills in procurement that they can utilize. So by even giving out fuel or giving out personal protective equipment, so many areas that private sector can play a role. Last but not the least, advocacy and political lobbying. During the time of the Ebola outbreak, more than 34 countries levied trade and travel restrictions against WHO's advice. And that affects trade, that affects economies, that affects private sector as well. But private sector has a lot of clout, and they can play a major role here. They can play a role in putting pressure on government to ensure they don't do that without scientific evidence. In the end, I'd like to end with this quote by Primo Levi that he wrote for Holocaust, but I feel it really rings true when you talk about epidemics as well. It happened, therefore it can happen again. It can happen, and it can happen everywhere. And this was actually quoted to me by one of the people that I had interviewed during my research. And I really think it rings true when you talk about epidemics. So, I have a vision here, and the vision is that with good data, with ensuring multi-sectoral partnerships, with ensuring collective action, we can see a future where we can stop outbreaks from becoming full-fledged epidemics and pandemics. If you have a few minutes when you go back home, do check out this website called nomoreepidemics.org. It's basically a website dedicated to advocacy between the private sector, civil society, and the governments in order to ensure we can strengthen our health systems and strengthen our information systems and collaborate to end epidemics. And I really hope that's one thing, one message that you can take from here is collaboration is one way we can see a very bright future when we talk about epidemics, hopefully. Thank you.